different gospel authors place Jesus cleansing the temple in different places. Some people they essentially said, well, Jesus did this twice. He did it at two different times in his ministry. And that felt like a good enough answer for a while. When I started reading all the accounts of Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, I started seeing similar differences, but I couldn't apply the same solution. I couldn't say, well, Jesus was crucified multiple times and he resurrected different ways. And so it was really straining my faith. Does your latest book provide another solution to this tension?
Yeah, I mean, we deal with a whole lot of the differences in the Gospels, and we try to take a very honest look at these and approach it in an authentic manner and say, what is the best explanation for accounting for these differences? Are they errors, contradictions? Is harmonization the best approach to this, or is there a different way?
If you're doubting or deconstructing your faith, you're in the right place. On this podcast, we aim to be totally honest about doubt, but still hopeful about faith. Doubters are welcome here. Today, I'm talking again with historian Dr. Mike Licona. He's a professor of New Testament studies at Houston Christian University. He has an excellent YouTube channel where he shares his research, and today we're discussing his latest book entitled Jesus Contradicted. Now, if you listen to the podcast regularly, you'll know that it often features the personal stories of people experiencing doubt. So why a sudden dive into history and biblical studies? Questions about the Bible played a huge part in my experience of doubt, and as I continue to have conversations with many doubting Christians, I'm learning that it does for others as well. So I wish I had discovered Dr. Licona and his work years earlier, because I think he presents an academically rigorous and satisfying explanation for why there are differences in the Gospels, but I'll let you decide, so enjoy the conversation. Oh, and stick around to the end because this podcast is doing something it's never done before. Chat then. What was it that actually brought you to a place where you wanted to write several books on dealing with differences in the Gospels?
It started back in probably around 2009, 2010. I was teaching a graduate level class on the resurrection of Jesus. And on the final day of that course, we watched my 2009 debate with Bart Ehrman on the resurrection of Jesus. At the end, I asked the students, I said, so what'd you guys think? And everybody thought I won the debate. But I remember there was one student in the class, and she said, the problem I had with you in that debate is Ehrman brought up all these objections against the Gospels, especially gospel differences, and you didn't address them. And it has really rocked my faith in the Gospels. I asked the class, I said, how many of you it has really challenged your faith? It rocked your faith. It really troubled you, what he was saying about the Gospels, and that I didn't answer it. And a number of them, maybe a third of them, raised their hands. I said to them, we only have so much time to cover various issues in a debate. And what I pointed out is that my argument for the resurrection of Jesus was in no way contingent on the reliability of the Gospels. And in fact, it didn't even rely on the Gospels. And so Ehrman's argument was just one big red herring. So I could have gone off track and talked about the reliability of the Gospels and addressed those objections, but then it would have gotten me off track. I just tried to keep pulling it back to the topic we were debating was, and that's whether historians can prove with some degree of certainty or confidence that Jesus rose from the dead. But at that point, I understood, Matt, that a number of Christians really struggle over this. And I mean, for me, at one point in the past, in the late 1980s, it really bothered me, looking at these differences in the Gospels. But once I came to understand that Jesus rose from the dead, I mean, if Jesus rose from the dead, it's game, set, match. Christianity's true, period. So even if there are discrepancies or contradictions or errors in the Gospels, it doesn't undermine the truth of Christianity if Jesus rose from the dead. So once you have that settled in your mind like that, well, then some of these things that you may have considered of great importance before, just they kind of take a back seat. But I understood that a lot of Christians had difficulty with this. And so that's why I set out to to look at this. I've got 5.5 pages of people who have emailed me telling me how much this book has meant to them and has helped them. So
yeah, having that as a foundation has been so incredibly helpful to me. And an illustration I think you give in the book, which I think is helpful, is that if Jesus rose from the dead, Christianity was true before any author began penning the New Testament. So
that's right.
It's independently true of the New Testament. That doesn't mean the New Testament isn't also true, but the truthfulness of Jesus' resurrection is not dependent on what was written in the Gospels. So yeah, that's very helpful. In my, developing faith as a teenager and even in my early 20s, I didn't understand any other way that we could actually deal with differences in the Gospels other than trying to harmonize them. But in your book, you write that harmonization efforts, such as appealing to the normal variations between eyewitnesses, should not be the default approach towards solving gospel differences. So that's a bit of a switch of perspective for me. Can you explain why that's the case, particularly in the context of the relationship between the actual Gospels?
Let's start with the relationship between the Gospels. For some time now, it has been understood by scholars who spend their time studying as New Testament scholars. There's a universal consensus on this, that Matthew, Mark, and Luke share a whole lot in common, more so than John. That's not to say that John contradicts Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but all you have to do is this. It's a simple exercise. Read through Matthew, say 5 times, then read Mark 5 times, then read Luke 5 times, and then read John 5 times. And you'll notice that John, even though the message is the same, John sounds a whole lot different. Jesus in John sounds a whole lot different in his words, his approach, than he does in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And when you read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, many times the wording is very similar. You have these verbal similarities. In fact, they're so similar that scholars have created what's called a synopsis of the 4 Gospels, where they'll take each story in the Gospel and they'll put them in parallel columns. Like if you look at the feeding of the 5,000, it'll have it in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So you compare it word for word with what they look like. And you'll see that Matthew, Mark, and Luke, very similar. John, is a little bit different in the wording and things like this. There is a literary relationship between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. In other words, one of them was written first, and the others made use of that first gospel. They are referred to as the synoptic gospels, which comes from 2 Greek words, sun meaning with, and opsis meaning to view. So you can view them together, and they're very, very similar. So if there's a literary relationship between them, figuring out that relationship, who wrote first and then who used who and supplemented that, that is something that scholars refer to as the synoptic problem. It's not really a problem, it's a puzzle. I think synoptic puzzle would probably be a better term, but it's called the synoptic problem. The approach that I take in the book is, with most scholars today, including evangelicals, they think Mark was written first and that Matthew and Luke made use of Mark and supplemented it. When they are using Mark and you see these striking verbal similarities, sometimes they're different. So let me give you just one example, Jesus' baptism. So in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus comes out of the water, Holy Spirit, comes down on him, voice comes out from heaven. In Mark and in Luke, the voice says, "You are my beloved Son, with you I am well pleased." The voice is directly addressing Jesus. In Matthew, the voice says, "This is my beloved Son, with him I am well pleased." The voice, God's voice, is directly addressing the onlookers, the crowds. Now, Matthew wasn't present at this. He wasn't a disciple at that time. Given the verbal similarities, it's almost certain that he is using Mark as his source. So he has changed what God has said. It's a very minor change, but he's changed the addressee, transferring it from Jesus to the crowd. Now, you can try to harmonize it and say, well, maybe God spoke to Jesus and then he spoke to the crowd. Well, congratulations. You've done the same thing as the gospel of the Ebionites did in the 2nd century. I agree with Augustine here that Matthew changed the addressee here from Jesus to the onlookers in order to make this a little more personable to Matthew's readers. In other words, God is speaking to them, affirming Jesus as his son and that he has approved him. That's just one example. I could give you many like that, okay? I don't think harmonization in these cases is the best approach. There are other reasons which we could refer to as compositional devices, which Matthew is using here, something called transferal. He's transferring the recipient of the message from Jesus to the crowd. It's a very common literary device or compositional device back then. It's in all ancient biographies. We find this kind of stuff going on. That's why I think that if this is the kind of stuff that was taught to students in their teens on how to write, and we know that it was, and we see it on a regular basis in non-Christian literature like Plutarch's Lives and other histories and biographies, and it's common in that, then when we see these same kind of things occurring in the Gospels, it's like, okay, well, that makes sense on why it's there. And maybe recognizing that the gospel authors used compositional devices, which was part and parcel of writing ancient biography back then. In fact, we use a lot of them even today in our ordinary everyday conversations. That should be our default position rather than harmonization.
Well, what I found this to be an interesting aha moment when I was reading your book, like the fact that the Gospels are not totally independent eyewitnesses who are accounting the same story but including different details or, framing things slightly differently from their perspective. It seems like, no, they actually, they are talking to one another in a literary context. Maybe, as you suggest, Matthew and Luke drawing on Mark. And so the differences are not just the variations that we would expect among eyewitnesses necessarily. It might be that they're changing things for a particular reason. And that was a bit of an aha moment for me. What I'd love to do is to just let you expand on what you've said. You say this in the book as well, is that scholars are kind of moving towards reclaiming, the Gospels are actually ancient biographies. What is that genre, and what could we expect of how they write that genre?
Let me first say that before the 1970s, it was widely agreed upon by scholars that, and this is both conservative and non-conservatives and skeptical ones alike, that the Gospels were a unique genre, nothing else written like them. They didn't belong to any kind of genre. And then in the 1970s, Charles Talbert wrote a book, I think it was called What is a Gospel? And in there, he contended that the Gospels were ancient biographies. And then you had Richard Burridge, who had been trained in the classics. He was doing his doctoral work. He decided to do his dissertation on the genre of the Gospels, and he wanted to disprove that the Gospels were ancient biographies and refute these other scholars who were saying that they were ancient biographies. And Burridge came to the conclusion, opposite conclusion of what he anticipated, and he concluded that the Gospels are ancient biographies. They belong to that genre. And now today, the vast majority of scholars believe that the Gospels are either ancient biographies or they participate a lot in that genre. So what is an ancient biography? Well, number one, a biography, just like today, is going to focus on an individual and on their life, whereas a history is going to be far more broader. It's not going to involve just a single character. It's going to focus on a lot of different things. So if you were to write a history of Canada, where you're from, it's going to cover a whole lot of stuff. But if you're going to focus on a single person, now that's a biography. So that's one thing. And the Gospels focus on a single person, on Jesus, right? Second, ancient biographies were of the same general length. There were exceptions, of course, but the same general length was somewhere between 10 and 25,000 words. And the reason being that way they could be fit on a single scroll. And the Gospels fit within that. You have Mark with 11,000 words and some change. He's the shortest. And then you have Luke I think he's at 19,000 and some change. He's the longest. So they all fit within the same length of a biography, whereas histories are longer. Plutarch, in his Life of Alexander the Great, it's the most frequently quoted passage in all of Plutarch's lives. And they were called lives back then, not biographies. And Plutarch is largely regarded as antiquity's greatest biographer. He wrote more than 60 biographies, of which 48 have survived. And Plutarch, in that passage, his Life of Alexander the Great, he said, look, you're going to have to be patient if I don't mention every great event in this person's life, such as in battles where thousands fell. He said, I am writing a life, a biography, not history. So he said, just as a painter is painting a portrait, is going to focus his attention on the face and especially the eyes in order to communicate the character of this person, the kind of person that they were, so will I focus on what this person said and did in order to communicate the character of this person. And so this yields great tasty fruit when we're reading the Gospels that you may not see otherwise. So for example, for years you've had skeptical scholars saying that there's an evolution of who Jesus is in the Gospels. So in Mark's Gospel, he's not divine. He's a great man. He's a prophet. He's Messiah. In Matthew, he's a little bit more. In Luke, he's the Son of God. In John, he's God. In fact, a Muslim that I've debated on 3 occasions, Shabir Ali, says it's a snowball effect as Jesus rolls from one gospel to the next. Kind of a cool word picture, although it's false. But when you read the Gospel of Mark in view of its biographical genre, the deity of Christ, that he is God, comes out a lot more clearly. So for example, in Mark chapter 1, it starts off, as Isaiah the prophet said, a voice crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his path straight. Well, you would think by that this biography is going to be on a prophet preparing the way for the Lord, for God. That's what Isaiah is talking about. So you would think this is going to be Jesus preparing the way for God if it's a biography about Jesus, but actually it's talking about John the Baptist preparing the way for Jesus. So what does that say from the very get-go on who Mark thinks Jesus is? He thinks he's God. Mark chapter 2, Jesus heals a paralytic and forgives his sins. The Jewish leaders there say, well, that's blasphemy. Why? Only God forgives sins. Chapter 3, you have Jesus calms the storm, the wind, and the waves, something the Old Testament says God does. Chapter 4, Jesus casts out demons, and the Jewish leaders present say, he's Satan casting out Satan. So then Jesus gives a word picture, and he says, listen, if you want to go in and rob a strong man, you have to bind the strong man first, and then you can go into his house and plunder his goods. What he's saying there is his exorcisms is Jesus binding the strong man who is Satan and now is plundering Satan's kingdom of souls. Well, what human can bind Satan? And then in the next chapter, he raises the dead, something the Old Testament says God does. Chapter 6, he walks on water, something the Old Testament says God does. And then the things Jesus says throughout his gospel are things that would be attributed to God. He calls himself this apocalyptic Son of Man who's going to judge the world, referring to the Son of Man in Daniel 7, who's a divine figure that Daniel says is going to receive worship as only God deserves. It's very clear as you're going through Mark's gospel and you're reading it within its biographical genre that Mark is painting a literary portrait of Jesus as God's uniquely divine son. He's deity. If God shares a sort of divine DNA, Jesus shares it with him. He's no less God. So that's some stuff on ancient biography. There's more, but that should be enough for now.
Yeah, I mean, it's really helpful and very interesting. Christians say, in understanding the scriptures in terms of their genre are incredibly important. You've devoted a lot of time to it, but generally speaking, people have not devoted a lot of time to understanding really what ancient biography is. What is that genre? What does it include? So I'd also love for you to expand a little bit more on this illustration you use in the book about ancient biography as a portrait, as opposed to a snapshot or a photograph. What do you mean by that? I want you to explain it because I think it's something that 21st century Christians are kind of initially uncomfortable with, but I think it's important for us to consider it. So biography as a portrait.
Good question. Yeah, and here's something where genre is going to come in very important. So when we read the Psalms, and we read the psalmist saying that God's sleeping, we don't think the psalmist is in error or historically unreliable because God never sleeps. We know that this is a way for the poet to be saying, God, why don't you answer us? It seems like you're not around, that you don't care. And he uses the metaphor of God sleeping. When we come to the parables of Jesus, let's say the parable of the Good Samaritan, it would be wrong for someone to say that the Gospels are historically unreliable because the Good Samaritan never existed, right? Or that the Gospel authors were lying here by talking about a Good Samaritan, even though such was not a historical figure. You have to consider the genre. Same thing about Revelation. You could say the same kind of stuff. So when you come to the Gospels, it's typical to think of them in a modern sense of biography and saying that everything has to be exactly how it happened or else we're in trouble. But when you understand what ancient biography allowed some flexibilities in the way that things were reported in order to emphasize the character of the person, to make points more about their character or ethics, or in the case of the Gospels, maybe some theological points, a little bending of the details or altering of the details while the story remains an essentially faithful representation. That would have been okay in antiquity. They did that in biographies on a regular basis. So if you're going to judge the Gospels according to modern standards of precision, you're going to be disappointed. Okay. But if you view them through the lens of ancient biography, a lot more is going to come into focus, such as we saw with Christology there in Mark. One thing that you mentioned at the beginning of this discussion was about, when did Jesus cleanse the temple? Was it at the beginning of his ministry, like John said, or was it at the end, like the Synoptic Gospels report it? A lot of scholars, perhaps most, would say it's inconceivable that the Jewish leadership would have allowed Jesus to do it 2 times, and that it probably happened just once. And most would think that that John relocated this. He displaced it from its original context and transplanted it at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. And as Craig Keener has said, John probably did this in order to frame the entirety of Jesus' ministry from beginning to end as a Passover. Jesus is our Passover lamb. So he would have done it in order to make a theological point. That would be a portrait by relocating Jesus cleansing the temple to paint the portrait of Jesus as our Passover lamb. Now, Plutarch did things similarly, not to make theological points, but to make other points. So, for example, there is this one occasion when Julius Caesar, before he crossed the Rubicon, he was in the small town when most report when he was what's called a quaestor. It's a minor type of political position of leadership. He's a quaestor, and he sees a statue of Alexander the Great, and he weeps. And they ask him why he was weeping. And he said, because here I am, and I haven't done anything major with my life, but I'm the same age as Alexander when he had conquered Macedonia to India. Well, I think Plutarch reports that this event happened when Caesar was praetor of Spain. Now, that's a higher position than quaestor. And it happened 8 years later than when these other ancient historians and biographers report this of Caesar. And Christopher Pelling, the foremost authority on Plutarch, says he thinks Plutarch displaced this event from when he was quaestor and transplanted it, relocated it when he is praetor, because it's just before the time that he's about to cross the Rubicon. And he does this in order to highlight why Caesar's about to cross the Rubicon. He wants to make something big out of his life. He's just seen this about Alexander, and he's grieved that he's done nothing. And it's this quest for power and legacy that motivates Caesar to cross the Rubicon. That was his true motivation for doing it. But by putting the story at that point in Caesar's life, it highlights that for the reader.
Right. And it seems like that relocation has nothing to do with inventing something or deceiving the reader. It has everything to do with highlighting a characteristic of the person that they're writing about.
That's right. That's the objective. It's not to be precise necessarily. You're allowed these kind of liberties in order to emphasize, to highlight these character traits of the person you're featuring in the biography. And the gospel authors do this as well.
Right. And That's uncomfortable to us, but it's unreasonable to assume that first century authors would be attempting to write in some way that a future person 2 millennia later would be comfortable with. Of course, they're going to write according to the genre that they're writing in and what they're used to. So that makes sense, but it puts us in an uncomfortable position where we have to rework some things. I guess as a follow-up, these compositional devices that you're talking about, it's not just that intelligent academics sat down and were able to identify them, which I suppose they could have done, but there are actually textbooks in the ancient world that laid these out. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes. So in antiquity, some students of more privileged families would learn how to read and write. And by the time they got to their secondary and tertiary levels of education, they would learn how to write well and advance stuff. So by the time they're in their mid-teens, they would be exposed to things called compositional textbooks. And they would have preliminary exercises referred to as progymnosmata, preliminary exercises on how to write certain things, how to paraphrase, how to write eulogies, how to write narratives, and things like this. We know this because some of these have survived. The earliest one was written by a guy named Theon, and he's writing sometime in the 1st century. And he's mentioning how these exercises aren't new. They've already been in existence. We just don't have any writings that have survived before Theon that spell these out. And Theon says that he's going to give some additional exercises not covered in the previous compositional textbooks. Theon's writing in Greek. Now, at the end of the 1st century, you have a guy named Quintilian, who was a rhetorician, and he's writing in Latin. And he's given a lot of the same exercises. And then later on, you have Hermogenes, Aphthonius, and others who write these compositional textbooks as well. And they cover much of the same stuff. So they'll teach things like how to paraphrase. Now, today we understand how a paraphrase works a little bit. You're just rewording things in some sense, a little bit or even a lot. Like our paraphrase of the Bible, if you read the Message, it's not word for word. It can be a loose paraphrase. It can be a tighter paraphrase to what was said. There's a spectrum here. But in antiquity, you could paraphrase even more loosely than what we would do today. So some of the things that Theon says that you can do in these exercises to paraphrase is you can add words in order to clarify, or you could abbreviate. You could change a statement to a question. You could change a question to a command. You could create a dialogue. So rather than a person just teaching something, like this doesn't happen. This is not an actual example, but let's say Jesus gives the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapters 5-7. Rather than that, Matthew could have just created a dialogue and having Jesus converse with his disciples and others, and they ask him questions and he answers with the teachings in the Sermon on the Mount. That would have been totally okay to do back then. That can be a little more entertaining or easier to follow for some people. There's a universal consensus among classicists that biographers and historians employ these means of paraphrase. And in fact, Theon himself says that historians, poets, and orators all use this in paraphrasing not only their own writings, but also the writings of others. And then you have what classicists, they go through and the various histories and biographies, and they see not only the paraphrase things, but they see other kinds of changes, and they recognize their different patterns of how these changes take place. And then they are able to identify compositional devices, like I mentioned, displacement and transferal and a number of others. So these aren't taught in the compositional textbooks, but we can observe them happening in the ancient literature.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Earlier, you almost interrupted yourself because when you say these words, when you list these compositional devices, you're so familiar with them that examples immediately come to mind. So I want to give you an opportunity to get some of those out. Could you give us more examples of how we see these compositional devices used in the Gospels, particularly, if you can, when a compositional device is a better explanation than trying to harmonize? I think a few examples of that would be very helpful.
How about creating a dialogue? So when Jesus heals the man with the withered hand, in Mark's gospel, Jesus is in the synagogue. Jewish leaders are there, and he sees the man with the withered hand. And the Jewish leaders there are wanting to see if he's going to heal the man so that they may condemn him. But Mark says, but Jesus knew their thoughts. And so he asked the man to come up, and then he asks the Jewish leaders, is it okay to heal on the Sabbath? And there's no answer from them. So then he says, look, if you lose a sheep or a cow falls into a hole on the Sabbath, is it okay to rescue it? Well, of course it is, right? So he gives that kind of illustration. Well, when you come to Matthew, he sees the man, and the Jewish leaders ask him, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? So in Mark, he knew their thoughts, but in Matthew, he has them express their thoughts, and then Jesus brings up the thing about, is it okay to pull the animal out of the pit that it falls into if it happens on the Sabbath? Give you one more example of not dialogue, but of transferal. In Plutarch's Lives, the Roman general Pompey, who Caesar would eventually defeat, he has a friend named Plancus who is on trial. And Pompey is outside of the city, and he's got his troops out there, so he's not allowed to come into the city. And he finds out that Plancus is on trial, and so he writes a speech, and he gives it to an emissary, according to Plutarch's Life of Cato the Younger. He gives it to an emissary who comes in and reads it at the trial of his friend Plancus. In Plutarch's Life of Pompey, he just have Pompey himself come into the trial and read it in person. Well, which one was it? Did he give it to an emissary, or did he come in himself? Well, we know from other historians he gave it to an emissary. And we also know from Roman law he would have given it to an emissary and would not have been allowed to come into the city. So what is Plutarch doing? I mean, we're talking about the same author using the same sources, writing at the same time. But it's a difference here. Well, it's pretty obvious that Plutarch has simplified the account and transferred who's reading the speech to Pompey, who actually wrote it anyway. He's still given an essentially faithful representation of what occurred. It's not accurate in a precise sense. Well, in the Gospels, there's a story about a centurion who wants Jesus to heal his servant. And so in Luke's Gospel, the centurion sends some Jewish emissaries, Jewish leaders out to ask Jesus to come heal his servant. And Jesus says, all right, let's go. And then the centurion gets a little scared, and he has some second thoughts, and he sends some friends out to meet Jesus and say, hey, look, I'm unworthy for you to come under my roof. I'm a man of authority just like you. So just say the word and my servant will be healed. And Jesus praises the centurion for his faith and heals his servant without ever seeing the centurion or his servant. Matthew simplifies the account just like Plutarch does in his Life of Pompey. And he has the centurion himself go out to meet Jesus and make the request. And Jesus praises the centurion for his faith and heals the servant without seeing the servant, but he was speaking directly to the centurion. So there are a lot of these things throughout the Gospels. I can give you more if you want.
Well, I think what I'll say is that in the book, you lay out so many examples. And I know the popular level book that I read is even less robust than your academic version. And you've given already a lot of examples in this conversation. So I guess I would say to a listener, I think it's worthwhile picking up your book and reading these, because I think you outline them in a pretty compelling way that the gospel writers are in fact using these compositional devices. One question that I wanted to really ask, which came to mind while reading your book, was that you do outline how Christian figures throughout history try to handle differences in the Gospels, and some of them try to harmonize things, including Augustine. My question while reading was, if Augustine took a different approach that didn't include these compositional devices or didn't rely on them as heavily as you're suggesting, wouldn't he have been much closer in time to those genres? Wouldn't he have been familiar with them? I tend to prefer what, the church fathers say because they're so much closer to these events. So why wouldn't Augustine agree with you? Why would he try to harmonize things rather than saying, these are compositional devices? Why didn't Augustine say that?
Good question. A really good question. I think it was because of his understanding of what it meant to say the Bible is divinely inspired. Okay. He probably thought of it more along the sense that many American evangelicals do today, a very strict view of it, where inspiration is almost like divine dictation. That's how it happened. Now, they'll say that it's not divine dictation, but when they define the inspiration and inerrancy, it's hardly distinguishable from it.
I know that depending on what you've been taught about the Bible and where you are in your journey through doubt, this conversation may have felt challenging. Trust me, I empathize with that. My conversation with Dr. Licona went on to discuss the implications of his work for doctrines like the inspiration and inerrancy of Scripture. And I don't want to overhype this, but I think what we discussed is rarely addressed among Christians, and I think the two principles he shared are the most helpful tools out there for helping people wrestle through their doubts about the Bible. That's a big statement, I get that, but I actually believe it. This podcast has never had a two-part discussion before, but I felt it would have been a disservice to you to cut down our conversation too much. So make sure you follow the podcast so you don't miss part 2 when it comes out in 2 weeks, and I'll see you then.